I have buried men who built their houses correctly. Square corners, milled lumber hauled 40 miles, lime mortar mixed by a fellow who done it back in Ohio and never let you forget it. Good men. Careful men. The kind a town leans on. And the winter of that year took them anyway, took them in their own beds with the wind reading their walls like a man reading a letter, finding every place the writing was thin. And I have sat alive in a one-room cabin chinked with nothing but wood ash and river clay, mixed by hand in a cracked iron pot, by a man the whole valley swore would freeze before Christmas. I am not going to tell you the smart money was wrong because the world is fair. The world is not fair, and I have the graves to prove it. I am going to tell you something harder than that, which is that sometimes the thing everybody laughs at is the only thing that holds, and you don't find out which is which until the night it's too late to choose. Stay with me. This is not a story about a clever trick that saved a man's life. It is a story about how long I stood in a doorway deciding whether a stranger's life was worth more than my pride, and how close I came to getting the answer wrong. Snow came sideways before I understood it was snow. That is the part nobody believes when I tell it now, sitting safe by a stove with their boots off. They think a storm announces itself. They think the sky goes the color of a bruise and gives you an hour to make your peace. Sometimes it does. That afternoon it did not. The morning had been bright and brittle, the kind of cold that makes the air taste like a nail in your mouth, and I'd ridden out anyway because a steer of mine had gone through the fence line up the north draw, and I was too stubborn. There's that word already. I'll wear it the whole story, too stubborn to let $140 on the hoof wander off and become a coyote's good week. My name is Wade Ellery. I ran cattle on the flats below Quitman Ridge for 19 years before this happened, and I am old enough now that the 19 feels like a thing I did to someone else and only heard about. I keep a logbook, have since the Army. Every night I write the weather, the count, anything that broke or bled or got born. I do it even when nothing happens, especially when nothing happens, because a man who only writes the big days ends up believing his whole life was nothing but big days, and that is a lie that'll rot you. So you can trust this account on one thing at least. I have the page. I have the page for that day, and it is the shortest entry in 19 years. It says in pencil in a hand that shook, storm, lived, his house held. I'll fill in the rest. The steer I never found. I want that on the record early, because people hear this story and want it to be tidy, want the steer to come trotting back at the end like a dog, and it didn't. It died somewhere in that white, and I never saw it again, not even the bones come spring. That's the first thing the country teaches you out there, and the thing greenhorns can't swallow. The country does not care what you rode out to save. It will let you lose the small thing and the big thing both in the same afternoon, and not change its face about it. So sideways snow. My horse, a good sorrel mare named Patience, named by my wife, who was the only soul on God's earth I'd have let saddle me with a name that sentimental Patience put her ears flat and stopped trusting the ground. Horses know weather in their feet before it reaches your face. I should have turned at the first flag of it. I counted instead. That's my habit, the thing my wife used to tease me dead about. I count. Fence posts, cattle, the steps from the porch to the well, my own breaths when I'm scared. I counted 9 fence posts north before the visibility ate the 10th, and somewhere around 6 I understood, the way you understand a fall has started and there's no taking it back, that I was not going to make it home. You do arithmetic in a moment like that and the arithmetic is ugly. My place lay 4 miles southwest. 4 miles is nothing on a clear day. 4 miles in a whiteout with the temperature falling like a dropped stone is a sentence, and not the kind a judge reads you, the kind that ends a paragraph and then ends you. I have seen what's left of men who guessed at 4 miles. The cold doesn't hurt at the finish, they say. I wouldn't know. The men who know don't say anything. There was one thing closer than home, one roof. And here is where I have to tell you about the Apache, because the whole rest of it turns on him, and on what I thought of him riding up out of that storm. We called him the Apache because we were the kind of people who'd give a man a name like a brand and never once ask the one his mother used. Some called him worse. He'd come to the valley 3, maybe 4 years before. Nobody agreed on the count, which tells you how little anyone watched him close enough to remember. He had filed on a quarter section up against the ridge that everyone else had passed over because the spring on it was unreliable and the wind came down that draw like it had a personal grievance. Bad land. The land you get when you are not the kind of man the land office wants to do favors for. He'd built a cabin there with his own hands and a fro and not much else, and he kept goats, of all things, and a small hard garden, and he traded honest at the mercantile and said little, and looked you in the eye exactly as long as politeness required and not 1 second longer. His name, I would learn, was Ottessa. I'll use it now even though I didn't have it then, because he is a man and not a brand, and I am too old to keep paying for the manners I didn't have at 50. The thing the valley could not leave alone about Ottessa was the seal. A log cabin is only as warm as its chinking, the stuff you pack between the logs to keep the wind from walking through. Out our way, the careful men used lime mortar if they could afford it and oakum if they couldn't, and the rest packed mud and straw and redid it every fall, cursing. Ottessa did none of that. He sealed his place with a mixture of wood ash and clay he dug from a particular bend of the creek, worked together wet into a gray paste that dried hard as a tooth and pale as bone. You could see it from the road, the white lines between his dark logs, like the cabin had been stitched together with scar tissue. The men laughed about it. Lord, did they laugh. Caleb Murdoch, who I will have to get to, stood in the mercantile one September afternoon and held court on the subject, the way Murdoch held court on every subject he had no real knowledge of, which was most of them. Ash and dirt, he said. The man's chinked his house with the bottom of last night's fire. First good blow'll find it powder and he'll wake up froze to his own goat. And the men laughed, and I laughed, and I want you to know I laughed, because if I leave that out then I am no better than Murdoch and a coward besides. I laughed at a thing I did not understand because the man I didn't understand it from was easier to laugh at than to ask. That's the whole sickness of it right there. We will mock what we won't ask about. It costs less. Now put me back in the storm. 6 fence posts, patients refusing the ground, home 4 miles and a death sentence, and up the slope to my right maybe half a mile, behind a curtain of snow that opened and closed like a hand, the one roof. I want to be honest about the next part because the honest part is the only part worth telling. I did not turn toward that cabin grateful for shelter. I turned toward it the way you reach for a railing on a stair you don't trust, with my whole body objecting. Some part of me, the cold animal part that wanted to live, hauled the reins. And the rest of me, the part that had laughed in the mercantile, the part that had spent 50 years being a certain kind of man in a certain kind of place, that part was already building the excuses I'd tell at the bar later. Had to. Storm came up. Couldn't help it. As though needing the help of a man like Ottessa was a thing I'd have to explain and live down. I am not proud of that. I'm telling you anyway. A confession you're proud of isn't a confession. The half-mile took the better part of an hour. I won't pretend I remember it clean. There's a thing the cold does where it starts to make the inside of your skull feel like a warm room you'd like to lie down in, and I caught myself listing in the saddle twice, caught myself once with my eyes already closed, and patience stopped dead. Just stopped, refusing to be the one who killed us both by walking off a drop she could feel and I couldn't see. I owe that mare a debt I paid in oats for 11 more years, and never came close to clearing. When the cabin finally came up out of the white, it came up wrong, too sudden. 1 second there was nothing, and the next there was a black wall an arm's length from Patience's nose, and I had the absurd, drowning thought, the logs, the white lines, the ash and the clay, and then I was off the horse, or fallen off. The difference didn't signify, and on my hands in snow that was already to my knees, and I was beating on a door I could barely see with a fist I could barely feel. I want you to understand that I did not know, hammering on that door, whether the man behind it would open it. There's no reason he should have. Think on it. A valley that named him like a dog and laughed at his house, and would not sit by him at church if he'd ever been fool enough to come. And here on his step in the worst storm in 20 years is one of the laughing men, one of the men who had, specifically by name, mocked the very walls that were about to save his sorry life. If Odessa had opened that door, looked at my frozen face, and shut it again, no court in the territory would have convened over it, and no preacher would have found the words. He'd have owed me exactly what I'd given him, which was nothing, which was less than nothing, which was contempt. I hammered and I called out, and the wind took the words off my lips and threw them away. And the door opened. It opened all at once, swung inward, and the warmth came out of it like a living thing, like a breath, like the whole cabin had been holding it in for me. Heat. Real heat, dense and orange, the kind you feel on your eyeballs. And in the doorway stood Odessa with a slush lamp in one hand, throwing his face half in light and half in nothing, and he looked at me. I will see this look the day I die. I expect it'll be the last thing. He looked at me without one flicker of surprise. As though he'd been standing there since the snow started, waiting on the particular fool the storm would send him. As though he had always known it would be one of us, and was only mildly curious which. He did not say, "You laughed at my house." He did not say, "Now look." He did not say anything at all that a smaller man would have earned the right to say. He stepped back and tilted his head the smallest amount toward the fire, and that was the whole of his welcome. I went in on my hands and knees. I'm not ashamed of that part. A man should go into mercy on his knees. It's the only honest way to enter it. The cabin was one room, and the room was warm in a way my own house, my good house with its lime mortar, was never warm. That was the first thing that broke something loose in me, before I could even feel my hands again, the simple, stupid, undeniable fact of the heat. The fire was small. That's what I couldn't reconcile, lying there steaming on his floor. A small fire, banked careful, nothing like the roaring waste I'd have built. A small fire in a warm room, and outside a storm that was at that moment killing things across 40 miles of country, and the wind was leaning on those walls with everything it had and getting nothing back. Nothing. Not a draft. Not a whisper through the logs. The white lines between the dark would held the cold out the way a dam holds water, and I lay on the floor of a house I had laughed at, and I started, to my everlasting humiliation, to cry. From the warmth. Just from the warmth. Odessa let me. That's a kindness people don't credit, the kindness of letting a man fall apart without an audience that comments on it. He turned away to the fire and gave me his back, not from rudeness but from the opposite of it, busying himself with a pot and a tin cup so that I could be a grown man weeping on his floor in something like privacy. When I had myself back together, more or less, he turned around and handed me the cup without a word. It was broth, thin, with something wild and bitter in it I couldn't name, and it was the best thing I have ever drunk before or since, and I have drunk champagne at a governor's table. We didn't speak for a long while. There wasn't a need yet, and he wasn't a man to manufacture one. I sat with the cup and watched the fire and listened to the storm fail against the walls, and I started slow, the way feeling comes back to a frozen hand, painful, prickling, unwelcome, to do some accounting. Not of cattle, of myself. Here is what the warmth was telling me, and I didn't want to hear it. The man had been right. Not lucky. Not stubborn in some quaint way that happened to work out. Right. He had looked at the same logs and the same wind and the same country as the rest of us, and he had reasoned his way to a better answer, and we had laughed because the answer came out of a fire instead of a sack of milled lime from a catalog, and because of the color of the hand that mixed it. That was all our laughter had ever been. The shape of an answer offends us when it comes from a person we've decided shouldn't have answers. I want to tell you I said some of this to him that first night. I didn't. I'm a slow man and pride freezes slower than fingers. What I said when I finally said anything was the small thing, the coward's true thing. I said, "Your house is warm." He looked at me a moment. The fire moved in his eyes, and he said the first words I ever heard him say. This man I'd lived 4 miles from for 4 years, he said. Yes. Not I told you so. Not your friends should see it now. Just yes. The plain agreement of a man with the truth. As though my surprise was the only strange thing in the room, and the warmth itself was the most ordinary fact in the world, which of course, to him, it was. He'd been warm every night of every winter while we waited for him to freeze. The freezing had only ever lived in our mouths. The wind picked up then I wouldn't have thought it could, and somewhere out in the white something cracked and went down. A tree or a fence or a shed. A long tearing groan, and then a thud you felt through the floor. Otis's head came up at the sound and turned toward it, and for the first time that night I saw something move across his face that wasn't calm. He stood. He went to the small dark window, scraped the frost with the side of his hand, and looked out into nothing, and stood looking a long time at a thing I couldn't see, and he couldn't either, not really, but was looking at all the same. "Someone is out there," he said. I told him no one would be fool enough. I told him no one but me had been fool enough, and look what it cost. He didn't turn from the window. "The Prout place is below the draw," he said. "Smoke this morning, none now." And I sat there in his warm house with his broth going cold in my hands, and I understood that the night was not going to let me only be saved. It was going to ask me something. It was going to make me choose, with my body still half frozen and my debt to this man not an hour old, whether the warm I had just been given was a thing I got to keep, or a thing I now owed forward into the very storm I just barely crawled out of. I looked at the door, I looked at the fire, and Odessa was already reaching for his coat. There is a kind of tired that argues with you, and there is a kind that doesn't bother. When Odessa reached for his coat, the tired in me didn't bother. It just lay down inside my chest like a dog by the fire and said, plainly, without drama, "You cannot go back out into that, and if you do you will die, and you have a daughter in Messilla who is already going to have to bury you someday and would prefer it be later. My daughter's name is Ruth." I thought of her in that exact second, standing in his cabin with a borrowed warmth in my hands, and I thought of her getting the letter, and I will tell you that the thought did not make me brave. It made me want to sit down. The people we love are not always a rope that pulls us toward the right thing. Sometimes they're an anchor the wrong way, a reason to keep your own skin, and a man who tells you different has never had much to lose. So I said the cowardly sensible thing, the thing any reasonable man at the bar would have nodded at. I said, "Odessa, we'll never find it. We'll die 50 yards from your door, and the Prouts'll die anyway, and there'll be 5 graves instead of 3. He had his coat on by then. It was a strange coat, a trade blanket coat, worn through at the elbows, with a hood he'd sewn on himself by the look of the stitching, which was better than mine would have been. He was packing things into a flour sack with the unhurried speed of a man who had done a hard thing in the dark before, and knew that panic was just a way of wasting the heat in your own muscles. A coil of rope, a second slush lamp, a flat parcel of what turned out to be pemmican, his own make, that I'd live on for the next day and never get the recipe of. He didn't argue with me. That was the worst part. If he'd argued, I could have argued back and felt righteous. He just kept packing, and after a moment, without looking up, he said the thing that took the floor out from under me. He said, "How many in your house when you are not in it?" I didn't follow him. I said none. My wife was 3 years dead, and Ruth was married off to a clerk in Messilla. And he nodded like I'd confirmed something and said, "The Prouts have the 2 small ones, and the woman is carrying a 3rd. I had not known that. I had not known one single thing about the Prouts beyond their name, and the fact that Tom Prout owed at the mercantile and was slow to pay. I had lived a half-mile from a family with 2 small children and a 3rd coming, and I knew their debt and not their children's faces, and the man the valley laughed at knew the woman was expecting. He knew it because he was the kind of man who looked at people long enough to learn things, the very habit we'd punished him for, the looking too long. And now that habit, that thing we'd taken for impertinence, was the only reason anyone in the world knew there were 5 lives below that draw instead of 2. I put down the cup. I want that to be the hinge of this whole account, that small motion, because it was the moment I stopped being a man the storm had saved and started being a man who had to decide what he'd been saved for. I put down the cup, and I stood up, and my legs nearly went, and Odessa caught my arm without seeming to move, just was suddenly there, and held me up until the floor stopped tilting. "You don't have to," he said, and he meant it. There was no test in it, no trap, no quiet scorekeeping. He was telling me a true thing, that a man fresh out of the cold's mouth has paid his toll and owes nobody another crossing. He'd have gone alone. He'd have gone alone into a storm to drag out a family that, I'd have bet my place on it, had never once spoken to him kindly, and he'd have done it without a word to anyone and never mentioned it after. And if he died doing it, the valley would have said the Apache wandered off in the storm, never had the sense God gave a goat, and gone on with their coffee. "I'm coming," I said. He looked at me one more second. Then he handed me the coil of rope to carry, which I understood later was a gift. Giving me the rope made me necessary, gave my legs a reason that wasn't pity, let me walk back into that storm as a man with a job instead of a man being humored. He thought of things like that. I have known generals who couldn't manage a kindness that fine. We roped ourselves together at the waist with maybe 10 feet between us, and we tied the near end to a staple by his door, so we could find our way home along it like a thread through a cave. And then he banked the fire. Even then, even with 2 children dying below the draw, he banked the fire careful, because the warm we came back to would matter as much as the warm we left. And a man who lets his fire die to save someone has just arranged for everyone to freeze later. That is the thing about him I keep circling. He was not warm because he was soft. He was warm because he was the most clear-eyed man about cold I have ever met. He had stared at the worst the country could do and made his peace with the arithmetic of it, and that peace was what let him be gentle. The gentleness was downstream of the hardness. I had it backwards my whole life. I thought you had to choose. The storm, when we went back into it, was worse. I won't dress it up. It was a thing without mercy and without shape, a roar and a sting and a cold that was not a temperature anymore but an intention. And within 20 steps I could not see Odessa, though I could feel the rope at my waist tug and slacken with his walking. We went by the draw, by the lay of the land under our feet, by some sense of downhill that he had and I trusted because I had nothing else. I counted. Of course I counted. I counted steps to keep my mind from lying down in the warm room it kept trying to build. I got to 400 and something and lost it and started over. The number didn't matter. The counting was a rope too, a thread out of the cave of my own failing head, and I have wondered since whether all my counting, all those 19 years of it that my wife teased me for, was only ever me holding a thread in the dark and not knowing it. I felt the rope go suddenly tight and then slack and then nothing, and I stopped. And my heart did a thing I didn't like, because slack rope in a whiteout means the man on the other end has stopped, and you don't know if he stopped because he found the place or because he's gone down. I pulled. The rope pulled back twice, deliberate, and I understood it was a signal, though we'd agreed on no signals, and I went toward it on hands and knees, and my hand came down not on snow but on wood. A door. He'd found it. Don't ask me how. I have asked myself how for the rest of my life, and the only answer I've got is that some men carry a map of a country in their bodies after enough years in it. And he had walked half a mile blind through a killing storm to a door he'd never been welcomed at, and put his hand on it like he was knocking at his own. The Prout cabin was dark and it was cold, and it was the cold of a house that had given up. Their chinking had gone, packed mud, dried, cracked, fallen out in a dozen places along the north wall, and the wind was inside the house, inside it, walking the room like it owned the deed. There was no fire. There was the smell of cold ash, which is a different smell than warm ash, a dead smell, and under it a smell I knew and have spent my life trying to forget, which is the particular smell of a body that has begun to fail from the inside out from the cold. Tom Prout was on the floor by the dead hearth. He'd done the thing men do, the wrong brave thing, given his coat and his blanket to the children and the wife and kept nothing. And the cold had taken him first the way the cold takes the generous first, always. It is the one consistent cruelty I have witnessed, that the people who give their warmth away go first. He was breathing. Barely. His lips had gone a color lips should not go. The woman, her name was Effie. I learned it that night, kneeling. Effie Prout was up against the south wall, with the two little ones bundled under her and her arms around the whole bundle, and her own breath coming in the shallow sips of somebody 2 hours from the end. And she looked up when Otis's lamp came in the door, and I watched her face do a thing I have not got the words for after all these years. She saw him. She saw, in the doorway, the man the whole valley had taught her to fear, the man her husband had likely called something ugly at that same mercantile, lit from below by a slush lamp with snow caked white on his trade blanket hood and ice in his lashes, and she did not flinch. She was too far gone to flinch, maybe. Or maybe a person 2 hours from death has burned off every lie they were taught and can finally see a man clear. She reached one arm out from around her children, reached it toward him, and she said one word. She said, "Please." And the man who had every earthly right to stand in that doorway and let the valley reap exactly what it had sown, that man was already across the room and on his knees, and pulling the dead hearth's ashes aside with his bare hands to find a coal, any coal, and there were none. And so he did the other thing. He sent me back out. I want to be clear about what he asked, because it was the heaviest thing anyone has asked of me, and I nearly said no. He gave me the end of the rope, our rope, the thread home, and he told me to follow it back to his cabin, all that distance, alone now in the dark and the worse dark, and to bring fire. To bring a banked coal in the little iron pot he'd had the foresight to carry empty in the flour sack, and bring it back along the rope, and not let it die and not fall and not lie down. He would stay and work to keep the 5 of them alive with his own body and the blanket and what heat 2 grown bodies can throw. And he would trust me, a man he'd known for 2 hours, a man who had laughed at him at a counter, with the single thread that connected this dead house to a living fire. He trusted me with it, that's the part. He had every reason in the history of this country not to, and he handed me the rope and the pot and looked at me and said, "Don't run. Running wastes it. Walk and count." He'd seen me counting. He'd seen me in the worst of it, mouthing my numbers, and instead of taking it for the broken thing it probably looked like, he'd taken it for a tool, and he handed it back to me sharpened. Walk and count. I have been given orders by hard men in hard places, and not one of them ever understood me well enough to give me an order I could actually keep. I went back out alone. I am not going to pretend I was brave in that half-mile. I was so afraid that I made noises I'm glad no one heard. But I held the rope and I held the empty pot and I walked and I counted, and the counting held. The counting was a floor under me when there was no floor, 1 and 2 and 3, and the wind trying to peel my numbers off me and me keeping them, hoarding them. The way Otis hoarded the heat of his small fire, not wasting, never wasting. And his door came up out of the white, and I had never in my life been so glad to see a thing made by human hands. I built the coal in his pot from his banked fire with hands that were learning, fast, how he did things small, contained, no waste, feed it only what it needs. I cracked a piece of the ashen clay seal off the inside of his doorframe doing it, a flake the size of a coin, and I held that flake in my palm a moment, this pale hard scrap of the thing the whole valley had laughed at, and I'll tell you it was warm. The seal itself was warm to the touch on the inside, holding the cabin's heat in its body like a stone by a fire. We had laughed at a thing that was, at that very moment, the warmest object I could find in a county full of dying. I put the flake in my pocket, I have it yet. Then I went back out into the storm a 3rd time, with fire in a pot and a thread in my fist, walking and counting, carrying a small living coal through the largest dead cold I have ever crossed, toward a house where a man the world had thrown away was keeping a whole family breathing with the warmth of his own back. We got the fire lit. I'll give you that much before the part fades. We got it lit, in the Prout's dead hearth, with Odyssey shielding the new coal from the wind that owned the room while I fed its shavings off the legs of their own kitchen stool, because there was no other dry wood, and the flame caught, and took, and the orange came up in that dead house like something being argued back across a line it had nearly crossed. Effie Prout made a sound when the light came that I will not try to describe. Tom Prout's color started slow to come back from the place it had gone. But that is the easy part to tell, the fire catching, because that's the part that feels like victory, and I have learned to be suspicious of the parts that feel like victory. Here is the part I've never told anyone, the part I'm telling now because I'm old and there's no one left to protect by silence. While the fire was catching, while Odyssey was bent over it with his whole self, I was the one holding the two children, and the smaller one, a boy maybe 4, had stopped shivering. People who don't know cold think shivering is the danger. It isn't. The shivering is the body still fighting. It's when the shivering stops that you've to be afraid. The boy had gone still and quiet and almost peaceful in my arms, and I knew what that was, and I did the thing you do. I rubbed his small back in his small hands, and I put my mouth near his ear and I counted to him, out loud because it was all I had, and I asked him to count with me, and for the longest stretch of my life he didn't. And then he did, small, furious. Wrong. 2, he said when I said 1. 2, like he was correcting me, like even half froze he was a 4-year-old and would not be told. And I have never in my life loved a wrong answer the way I loved that one. He lived. They all lived. I'm telling you that now so the rest doesn't sit too heavy on you. But there was a moment, holding that still boy before he said his furious wrong number, when I understood the thing the whole night had been walking me toward, and it is not a comfortable thing, and I won't make it comfortable. I understood that I had lived 50 years a half-mile from these people, and let the cold of my own indifference walk through my walls same as the wind walked through theirs, and that the only man in the valley who'd kept himself truly warm, all the way through, was the one we decided had no right to the warmth at all. Odyssey looked up from the fire then, just for a moment, and caught me holding the boy and counting, and something passed over his face. Not a smile. He wasn't a man who spent smiles on a night like that, but a kind of recognition, one man seeing another finally do the thing he should have been doing all along. He didn't say anything. He turned back to the fire and fed it, careful, only what it needed. Outside, the storm went on like it would never end. But it would. They always do. And what comes after a storm, I was about to learn, is sometimes harder on a man than the storm, because the storm only asks whether you'll live, and the morning after asks who you're going to be about it. Ridden out into. That's the thing about a great cold. It doesn't just stop the world, it edits it. When the wind finally lay down and the sun came up hard and false cheerful over a valley scrubbed to the bone, there were absences everywhere, holes in the familiar where things used to be. The Holly's windmill gone, just the legs of it standing like something flayed. Half of Dorsey's herd standing dead and upright in the lee of a bluff, frozen on their feet, which is a thing I'd heard about and never wanted to see and will now see whenever I close my eyes too long. And my steer, I told you at the start, I never found him. Somewhere under all that blinding white was $140, and the whole reason I'd ridden out, and the country had taken him, and would not even give me the satisfaction of a carcass to be angry at. The land does not care what you rode out to save. I'd known it as a saying my whole life. I knew it now as a fact with a temperature. We got the Prouts moved. That first clear day, the 4 of us who could walk made a kind of sledge from their door and dragged Tom Prout on it the long way around the draw to Odyssey's cabin, because Odyssey's was the only roof in reach that was actually warm, and there is an irony in that I'll let stand without poking at it, that the family the valley would have called good Christian people spent their recovery under the chinking the valley had laughed loudest about. Effie walked the whole way with the new one still inside her and a child on each hip when the snow let her, and refused every offer to be carried. Stubborn. There's that word again. I've started to think it's the only one that ever mattered out here. The careful men are gone. The stubborn ones dragged each other through the snow. I keep coming back to one moment from that walk. We'd stopped to rest, the men, and Tom Prout was awake on the sledge by then, gray and weak but awake, and he looked up at Odessa standing over him against that hard blue sky, and you could see Tom trying to find words and not having any that fit, because the only words he'd ever used for this man were words you couldn't say to someone who just kept your children breathing with his own back through a night that killed cattle on their feet. And Tom Prout, who I'd have told you was not a man with much in him, did the one right thing available to him. He stopped trying to talk and just put out his hand. And Odessa looked at it a moment, a beat too long, long enough that I held my breath and then took it. Held it. Two men who'd never have shaken hands in church, holding on out there in the wreck of everything, and neither of them able to say a word and not needing to. I have been at weddings less married than that handshake. Word travels in a valley the way fire travels in a wall, slow, hidden, and then all at once. By the time the roads opened, everyone knew. Knew the Prouts had been dragged back from the dead. Knew it was the Apache who did it. Knew, and this was the part that lodged in the valley's throat and would not go down, knew that his ashen clay cabin had ridden out the worst storm in 20 years without a draft, while better houses, milled and mortared and built correct, had killed the people sleeping in them. Because they had. I have to tell you that, and I have to tell it plain, because it's the hinge the whole reckoning turned on. Old Pleasant Hovey froze in his bed 3 miles east, in a frame house with a real stone chimney, because the cold found the gaps a chimney makes, and he was alone and old and didn't wake. The Settle boy lost most of a foot. And Caleb Murdoch. I told you I'd have to get to Murdoch, Caleb Murdoch, who'd held court in the mercantile on the subject of ash and dirt, who'd promised us all that the Apache would wake froze to his own goat. Caleb Murdoch spent that storm in his fine catalog-ordered house with its lime mortar, and woke on the second morning to find the north wall white with frost on the inside, and his wife's hands so cold she couldn't hold a cup for a week. They lived. But the man who'd laughed loudest about a cold house had spent 3 nights in one, and the man he'd laughed at had spent them warm, and there is no court in the world that hands down a sentence as exact as that one. I watched what the valley did with this after. I watched close, because by then I'd appointed myself a kind of witness, the way you do when you've seen a thing that's true and you can feel the world already starting to sand the edges off it. And what the valley did was not what the stories wanted to have done. Stories want a town to learn its lesson. They want Murdoch to walk up that ridge hat in hand and apologize, and the valley to take Odessa in, and a happy supper with everyone passing the same dish. That is not what people do. I'm sorry, but it isn't. What the valley did was harder to look at and truer. They didn't apologize. Apology would have meant admitting they'd been the kind of men who'd let a family freeze a half-mile off rather than learn one thing from a man they decided was beneath teaching them. No one can hold that and keep eating breakfast. So they did the other thing, the thing people do instead of changing. They got curious about the seal. They wanted the recipe. That was the shape the valley's reckoning took. Not we were wrong about a man, but what's the mixture exactly, how much ash, what clay, which bend of the creek. They came up the ridge, 1 and 2 at a time, the same men who wouldn't sit by him at church, and they stood in his yard with their hats in their hands not from humility but from cold calculation, and they asked him how he did it, as though the warmth had been a trick all along and not a man. As though if they could just get the proportions they could have the warmth, without ever having to have asked the person. And here is the thing about Odessa that I have turned over every day since, the thing I most want you to carry out of this. He told them. He told them all of it, freely. The clay from the slow bend below the cottonwood, where the water dropped its finest silt. The ash from hardwood only, never pine. The way you worked it wet and let it cure slow out of the sun so it didn't crack. He stood in his yard and gave the recipe to the men who'd mocked him, the men whose curiosity was its own kind of insult, and he gave it the way he'd given me the rope and the broth and the warm, completely, without the little held-back portion that lets you feel superior later. I asked him why after. I was angry on his behalf, the way you get angry on behalf of someone who won't be angry for himself. I said he ought to have made them say it, ought to have made them admit what they'd done before he handed over the thing they'd laughed at. And he looked at me, we were friends by then as much as we'd ever be, which was more than I deserved and less than I wanted, and he said, then their children would be cold, to punish the fathers. That was all. Then their children would be cold. He would not let a child freeze to make a grown man learn manners. He'd already proven that on the Prout's floor with his own back. He gave away the warmth because warmth given away was the only kind he'd ever believed in, and the men who took it and never thanked him were, to his mind, simply men whose houses would now be warm, which was the whole point, which had always been the whole point, while we'd been busy making it about him. By the next winter, half the valley's houses had white lines between their dark logs. By the winter after that, it was just how you chinked a house, out our way. The new families that came didn't even know there'd been another method. They learned it from neighbors who'd learned it from neighbors, and somewhere in 2 short years the ash and the clay stopped being the Apache's strange trick and became how we do it here. A piece of plain valley wisdom with no name attached, no man behind it, no ridge, no night, no rope. I'd hear a fellow at the mercantile, sometimes the very counter, explaining the mixture to a greenhorn with the bottomless confidence of a man passing on ancient regional truth. And not once, not one single time in all the years, did I hear anyone say where it came from. They'd taken the warmth and erased the hand. That's the part that's bitter, and I won't sweeten it. The thing they mocked became the thing they all relied on, and the man who gave it to them became, in the telling, no one at all. There's a justice in the seal outlasting the laughter. There's a cruelty in the seal outlasting the man's name. They sit right next to each other, and I have never been able to pull them apart, and I've stopped trying. Some things are both at once, and asking which one they really are is just a way of refusing to hold them. Odyssey stayed 3 more years, and then he didn't. I won't make a tragedy of it where there wasn't one, or pretend I know what I don't. He didn't die. The valley didn't run him off, not in any way you could point to. He sold the quarter section, got a fair price, even, the spring having proved reliable enough through his careful management, which was its own quiet vindication of everything. And he loaded a wagon one spring and he went west and north, toward kin, he said, though he'd never spoken of kin before and I didn't press. A man's allowed to keep one door closed. I rode up the morning he left. I'd like to tell you we said the large things. We didn't. We weren't those men. He was checking the lashings on his wagon and I stood there fidgeting with a brass button off my late wife's coat that I carry, that I was turning over and over in my fingers the way I do, and I couldn't find the size of words the moment wanted. So I gave him the small true thing again, the way I had the first night. I said, your house kept us warm. And he stopped and looked at the cabin, the dark logs and the white lines, the seal still holding after 7 winters, pale and hard and warm to the touch on the inside where I knew it would be. And he looked back at me. And he didn't say yes this time. This time he said, it was a good house. Was, past tense with him not even gone yet, already handing it over to the next family and the next, already letting it stop being his. That was the most like grief I ever saw him allow himself, that one borrowed tense. Then he climbed up on the wagon and he looked down at me, and he said the last thing, and I've kept it the way I kept the flake of seal in my pocket, which I have to this day, this scrap of gray clay older than my granddaughter, warm once in my hand on the worst night of my life. He said, you count well, keep counting. And he clucked to the team and went down off the ridge. And I stood and watched the wagon until the road took it. The way you watch a fire you're not allowed to feed anymore, and I did not count his going. That's the one time. 50-some years of counting everything that moved, and I let that one go uncounted, because some things you should not measure, and a friend leaving is the first of them. So that's the page. Storm lived. His house held. The shortest entry in 19 years, and I've spent the rest of my life writing the margins of it. People who hear this story want me to tell them the lesson, and I've tried over the years and I keep failing because every version of the lesson is too small for the night. Don't judge a man by his color. True and not big enough. The thing you mock might save you. True and still not it. The closest I've come, and I'll give it to you and then I'll stop, is this. The valley spent years certain that warmth had to come from the right kind of man, built the right kind of way, ordered from the right kind of catalog, and a man we decided had no right to be warm at all stayed warmer than any of us, and then handed the warmth out to the very people who denied it to him, freely, because to him it was never about who deserved heat. It was only ever about who was cold. I think about Pleasant Hovey, froze in his correct house. I think about the settle boy's foot. I think about the steer I never found, the small loss the night threw in for free just to remind me it could. I think about Effie Prout walking the whole way through the snow and refusing to be carried, and the new baby that came that spring strong as a colt, and the boy who would not be told, the boy who said two when I said one, who is a grown man now with children of his own, in a house chinked with ash and clay, and who does not know my name or Otis's, and is warm. I drove past that boy's place last fall, saw the white lines between his dark logs, saw smoke coming up steady from a fire I knew, without being told, was banked careful and fed only what it needed. I sat on the road a long while in the cold, an old man in a tired mare's grandful, looking at a warm house full of people who'd never heard of the man who made them warm, and I thought about driving up the lane and knocking on the door and telling them. The whole of it. The storm and the rope and the broth and the seal and the name nobody kept. I didn't, I'm still not sure why. Maybe because the warmth was the gift and the story was only mine, and Odessa never once wanted credit, wanted only that the houses be warm and the children breathing, and they were, and they are. And what business did I have making his quiet kindness loud just so I could feel I'd settled some account that he had never, not for 1 minute, considered open? Or maybe I'm a coward still, in some last corner of me, and couldn't bear to be the old fool on the doorstep with the unbelievable story. I turned the mare for home. The flake of clay was warm in my pocket where my hand had been holding it. The smoke went up straight and patient into the cold.